All right, let's talk about something that gets complicated. Tithing. It's a source of so much confusion, right? A lot of guilt, a ton of debate. Is it a command? Is it just a good idea? What was it even for originally? We're going to dig in and see what the Bible really has to say.
Okay, so right off the bat, there's this huge disconnect. Most of us think of tithing as, dropping 10% in the offering plate. It pays for the building, the staff's salaries, the programs. But when you look at the original biblical system, wow, it was for something completely different. We're talking about literally feeding the religious workers, yeah, but also throwing these massive community-wide parties and creating a real social safety net so that nobody in the community would be left behind.
And this whole disconnect, it usually pushes people into one of two camps. Either you hear that verse about robbing God and you feel this wave of guilt, so you just comply. Or you swing all the way to the other side, getting defensive and saying, hey, the New Testament never commands it. But what if there's a third way? What if we can find a clearer, more balanced understanding of what this was all about? So to figure that out, we've got to go back, way back. We need to look at how tithing actually worked in ancient Israel. And I'm telling you, the reality is probably not what you think. It was way more complex, and honestly, a lot more radical than just giving a simple 10%. First things first, let's just break down the word itself. The Hebrew word is ma'aser, and you know what it means? Simply a tenth. That's it. It's just a straightforward math term. There's nothing mystical about it. It was basically an agricultural term for a society whose wealth was all about grain and wine and livestock. Now here's where it gets really interesting. There wasn't just one tithe. Nope. Ancient Israel actually had this multi-layered system. So check this out. First, you had the Levitical tithe. That's the 10% we know about to support the Levites, the full-time religious workers. But then there was a second 10%. That was the festival tithe, meant to fund these huge, joyful religious parties. And on top of that, every third year, another 10% was collected. That was the poor tithe, and it went directly to the local poor, to widows, orphans, and immigrants.
So let's do the math here. If you were a faithful Israelite, you weren't giving 10% a year, not even close. You were giving somewhere between 20 and 23% of your produce every single year. That 10% number that we get so focused on today, it was really just the starting point for a much, much bigger system of generosity.
And this whole system, it perfectly illustrates the Hebrew idea of kodesh, which we translate as holy. See, the tithe wasn't holy because giving it made you some kind of spiritual superstar. It was holy because it was set apart for a very specific practical purpose in God's kingdom. It was all about making sure his workers were fed and his people were cared for. It was about the kingdom functioning, not just checking off a religious box.
I mean, can we just pause on that festival tithe for a second? Because this is amazing. God literally commanded his people to take a full 10% of their income, go to Jerusalem, and throw a huge party. He told them to spend it on whatever your heart desires, oxen, sheep, wine, whatever. This wasn't some grim religious duty. This was worship through a divinely commanded community-wide celebration. How cool is that?
Okay, so now let's tackle the big one, the passage that causes so much trouble today, the book of Malachi. You know the one. It's used all the time to pressure people into giving. But if you take a closer look at the context, well, it reveals a pretty serious misunderstanding about who was really robbing God.
Yeah, you've definitely heard it. Will a man rob God? Bring the full tithe into the storehouse. I mean, those are powerful words, for sure. But here's the question we absolutely have to ask. Who was God talking to? Was this message for everybody, for the general population, or was it for someone else? Well, if you actually read the whole book of Malachi, the answer becomes crystal clear. From chapter 1, God is going right after the corrupt priests. He says to them, "O priests who despise my name." He calls them out for offering lame sacrifices and breaking their covenant. This whole rebuke, it's aimed squarely at the religious leaders. And this is a complete 180 from how this passage is usually taught. The curse in Malachi, it's not on the regular people who are struggling and can't afford to give. No, it's a curse on the religious leaders, the ones who were taking the people's tithes and offerings and hoarding them, using them for themselves instead of doing their job, maintaining the temple, and caring for the community. So, okay, that's the old covenant system. But then Jesus arrives and everything changes. The whole approach to giving shifts from this system of law to a totally new reality based on grace. And the difference is night and day. The old covenant tithing system was part of the law. It was a command, almost like a national tax you had to pay. But the new covenant, it introduces this idea of giving that just flows from grace.
The motivation isn't compulsion anymore. It's all about having a cheerful, willing heart.
This verse right here from 2 Corinthians is pretty much the cornerstone for all New Testament giving. The Apostle Paul is taking up a collection for believers who are in poverty, and his whole appeal is based on freedom, not on fear. And that phrase, not reluctantly or under compulsion, that's the key. Giving based on grace is a decision you make in your heart, not some rule that's enforced with threats.
And this brings up a huge logical question, right? If the central Christian message is that you've been freed from the curse of the law by Christ, how can a pastor then turn around and threaten you with a curse from an old covenant law, like the one in Malachi? It just doesn't add up. It's a major theological contradiction.
So where does that leave the whole 10% idea? Well, what if we just reframe it? Instead of seeing it as a law you have to obey to avoid getting cursed, what if we see it as a powerful wisdom principle? Like it's a training tool, a spiritual discipline that helps us break that soul-crushing grip that money and stuff can get on our hearts.
All right, so what's the takeaway here? How do we take all of this history and theology and actually apply it to our lives today? Let's boil it all down to a new standard for generosity.
Here's the bottom line. If a church is going to teach and promote tithing, then it really ought to function like the original system did. That means it needs to be a community where the money coming in is actively used to make sure that no member is going without basic needs: food, clothing, a place to live. That social safety net part is just as crucial as the worship part.
So here's a simple way to think about grace-based giving. 1. Give generously. Hey, 10% is a great goal to shoot for. 2. Give strategically. Make it count. 3. Support the teachers who are being faithful. And 4. Actively look for and meet the real needs of the people right there in your community.
And listen, this is so important, it needs to be said as clearly as possible. If you are in real financial trouble, if you're struggling with debt or just barely making ends meet, you are not robbing God if you can't give 10%. In fact, if we go by the original biblical model, you might be the exact person who should be receiving help from the community's pot.
Because at the end of the day, the goal of giving is all about the heart. It's about becoming a more generous person. It's about breaking money's power over your life. It's about putting people ahead of institutions. And it should always, always be done joyfully and sacrificially, but never, ever because you feel guilty, manipulated, or afraid.
And so that leaves us with one last really challenging question for all of us to think about. When you look at where your money goes, whether it's to a church or some other cause, ask yourself this: is my giving mostly just building up an institution? Or is it building a real community? A community where, like in the Bible, nobody gets left behind? The answer to that question? Well, it just might change everything.